The silence that greeted her was a living thing, a thick and suffocating entity that filled the grand hall with its weight. It was far worse than any jeer or shout could ever be. It was the sound of absolute dismissal. Elara stood on the revolving dais, a specimen presented for appraisal, and felt the collective gaze of the aristocracy strip her bare. It was not desire she saw in their eyes, nor even curiosity. It was a bland, almost offended, disinterest. She was lot 47, a number, a final worthless offering in a parade of omega perfection that had come before her. They had been radiant. Those others, each one a vision of health and allure, their scents a calculated perfume designed to intoxicate and incite bidding wars among the powerful alphas in the audience. Their presentations had been met with eager snarls and escalating prices, each gavel fall a celebration of their perceived value. Then there was her own scent. What little of it could push past the cloying layers of fear and despair was muted. It was the ghost of rain on dry soil, faint and forgotten. Her dress was not silk or fine linen, but a rough spun shift that chafed against skin that had known little but hardship. She was thin, her frame all sharp angles and pronounced bones, a testament to a long season of deprivation. But it was her face that held their attention for the brief, dismissive moment they afforded her. A vicious scar carved a path from her temple down to her jawline, a permanent and brutal testament to a rejection so violent it had nearly killed her. It was a mark that spoke of a spoiled past, of bad fortune, of a bond promised and then savagely severed. It was a story no one wished to purchase. Her hair, the color of dull earth, hung lank and lifeless around her shoulders. She kept her gaze fixed on a crack in the wooden floorboards of the stage, her ash-gray eyes devoid of any light. They were the eyes of someone who had already ceased to exist, who was merely waiting for the machinery of a cruel world to finish. Grinding her into dust, the auctioneer, a beta with a voice that had grown hoarse from the evening's excitement, tried to inject some semblance of enthusiasm into his spiel. A resilient specimen, he declared, his words echoing in the vast, unresponsive space. Untouched, unbonded. Think of the potential. The word potential hung in the air, absurd and mocking. The crowd saw no potential. They saw a broken thing, a liability. Whispers, not about her, but around her, slithered through the rows of seats. A fallen pack from the Northern Territories, a disgraced bloodline, a tragedy best left forgotten. She was not a prize to be won. She was a problem to be disposed of. The auctioneer's smile became strained. "Do I hear 50 crowns?" he asked, the number itself an insult in this company of immense wealth. A low chuckle rippled from the back of the hall. "Very well, 20. A strong back for menial labor, if nothing else." The silence deepened, becoming actively hostile. 10. The auctioneer pleaded, his professionalism crumbling into desperation. "Surely someone needs a scullery maid?" Elara closed her eyes. This was the final humiliation. To be so worthless that not a single soul, no matter how humble their means, would spend a pittance to own her. The rejection at the auction block was a public death sentence. Those no one wanted did not simply walk away. They vanished into a system that consumed the forgotten. She felt the last vestiges of her spirit crumble, the fragile will that had somehow kept her breathing through the pain now extinguished. She wished, with a fervency that was a prayer, for the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She wished for an end to the staring, to the shame, to the relentless ache of being. The auctioneer sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. He raised his gavel, the finality of the gesture a cold shock against Elara's soul. "It seems we have no takers. Very well, lot 47 will be remanded to 1,000,000 crowns. The voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was a low, calm rumble that carried an implicit alpha command, a wave of pure, unchallengeable authority that silenced the very air in the room. It vibrated through the marble floors and up through the soles of Elara's feet, a sensation so profound it forced her eyes open. Every head in the great hall turned in unison. Every single breath hitched. The auctioneer's arm froze, his gavel poised mid-descent. His mouth hung agape. Elara's own gaze, dulled by shock, followed the path of everyone else's. Up towards the highest balcony, a section shrouded in shadow and reserved for the most elite of patrons. A figure stood there, having risen from a seated position. He stepped forward out of the gloom. He was impossibly tall and broad-shouldered, a man carved from power and purpose. He was dressed in impeccably tailored black, the fabrics rich and severe. His features were sharp and commanding, his expression unreadable from this distance. But the force of his attention was a physical weight. It was him. Everyone knew him. The Alpha King, Kaelen. The auctioneer found his voice, a terrified squeak. Your Majesty? For this one? The king's head turned slowly, and though Elara could not see the details of his face, she felt the full intensity of his gaze leave her to land upon the stammering beta. Are you questioning my bid? The question was delivered with a soft, deadly precision that made the entire audience flinch. No, of course not. Sold. Sold to His Majesty, the Alpha King. The gavel fell. The crack was like the report of a gun, echoing through the stunned silence. Then, chaos erupted. A frenzy of confused, excited whispers exploded through the hall. Why? Why would he? What possible use could he have for her? Elara stood frozen, her mind a white noise of sheer, incomprehensible disbelief. This was not salvation. It was a deeper, more terrifying abyss. Strong, gentle hands she did not feel wrapped a luxuriously soft cloak around her trembling shoulders, its weight immense, embroidered with a crest she knew belonged to him. She was guided, not pushed, from the stage, led away not towards the servants' exit but through a private door reserved for royalty. The last thing she saw before the door closed was the crowd's bewildered, gaping faces. And the last thing she felt was the terrifying, inescapable certainty that her life, however broken, was no longer her own. It had been purchased for a king's ransom by a man whose motives were a terrifying mystery. The world became a soft, silent blur. Elara was aware of movement, of hushed voices that were not unkind, of the whisper of fine fabrics against her skin. The coarse shift was gone, replaced by a simple but impossibly soft linen nightdress. The crushing weight of the king's cloak had been exchanged for the gentle weight of a velvet coverlet. She was sitting on a bed so large she felt like a child, in a room so vast the firelight from the immense hearth failed to reach the corners of the vaulted ceiling. This was not a cell. It was a sanctuary. The walls were paneled in dark, polished wood, and tapestries depicting ancient forests and star-filled skies softened the stone. A bookshelf stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes. There was a sitting area by the fire, a writing desk of gleaming oak, and doors that led to a private bathing chamber. The air smelled of beeswax, old books, and a faint, clean scent of cedar. It was the most beautiful prison imaginable. She expected a jailer. Instead, a beta woman with a calm, lined face and neat gray hair brought her a tray. On it was a bowl of clear broth, a slice of warm bread, and a cup of herbal tea that steamed gently. You must try to eat something, miss, the woman said, her voice low and even. My name is Cora. I am to see to your needs. Elara's hands shook so badly she could not hold the spoon. Cora did not scold or force her. She simply held the bowl, allowing Elara to sip from it. The broth was warm and savory, a simple nourishment that felt like a miracle after the gruel she had survived on for so long. Each sip was an act of trust, a terrifying surrender to this new, bewildering reality. She slept then, a deep and dreamless exhaustion that felt like sinking into a warm sea. When she awoke, hours later, sunlight was streaming through the tall, leaded glass windows, painting golden patterns on the rug. The tray was gone. A new dress, a deep blue wool that was both modest and finely made, lay across a chair. Cora helped, her dress in silence, her touch efficient and respectful. The fabric did not scratch. It felt like an embrace. The door opened without a sound. King Kaelen filled the doorway. He was dressed less formally than at the auction, in dark trousers and a simple tunic that did nothing to diminish his inherent authority. In the full light of day, he was even more imposing. His features were starkly handsome, all sharp angles and firm lines, with eyes the color of a winter sky. They held a depth of intelligence and a weariness that she had not been able to see from the stage. He did not enter fully, respecting the invisible boundary of her space. May I come in? He asked. His voice was different now. The commanding rumble was still there, but it was sheathed, softened into a tone of genuine inquiry. Elara could only nod, her throat tight. He stepped inside, and the room seemed to shrink around his presence. He did not loom over her. He walked to the fireplace and leaned against the mantel, looking into the flames for a long moment before turning his gaze to her. This must be very frightening for you, he began. It was not a platitude. It was a simple, stark acknowledgement of her reality. I imagine you have a great many questions. I will answer them, as best I can. He told her his name was Kaelen. He did not use his title. He told her she was in the royal palace, in the West Wing. He told her she was safe, that no one would harm her here, and that the door was not locked. She was his guest, he stated with a quiet emphasis that felt like a vow, not his prisoner. Why? The word finally broke from her, a raw, broken sound. Why did you do it? Why me? He looked at her then, a long, considering look that felt like it reached into the deepest, most hidden parts of her soul. He did not look at her scar. He looked into her eyes. They saw a broken thing, he said, his voice low and deliberate. I saw a survivor. I have spent a lifetime surrounded by polished, perfect things that shatter at the slightest pressure. I have no use for them. He pushed away from the mantle and took a single step closer. The air stirred, and she caught his scent properly for the first time. It was not aggressive or overwhelming. It was the rich, smooth scent of aged whiskey and the warm, grounding smell of smoldering cedar. It was a scent of control and depth, and it should have terrified her. Instead, it wrapped around her strange, muted scent of rain and earth, not smothering it, but somehow acknowledging it. You are under my protection, Elara, he said, and the sound of her name on his lips, spoken not as a label but as a fact, sent a shiver through her. That is all you need to know for now. There are no expectations. There is no debt to be paid. You may stay in these rooms for as long as you wish. Cora will bring you anything you need. If you wish to see the gardens, she will take you. If you wish to see no one, that is also your right. He was giving her choices. However small, however constrained by circumstance, they were choices. It was a language she had forgotten how to speak. He left her then, with a final, lingering look that was not possessive, but contemplative. The door closed softly behind him. Elara stood in the center of the magnificent room alone. The silence was different now. It was not the silence of dismissal or of despair. It was the silence of a held breath. It was the quiet after a storm has passed, leaving the world washed clean and uncertain. The walls of her numbness, so carefully constructed, had not crumbled, but she felt the first, faint tremor of a crack. King Kaelen had not bought a slave. He had brought home a wounded creature and offered it a quiet place to heal. And that, in its own way, was the most terrifying thing of all. A fragile rhythm established itself in the days that followed. The sun would rise, and Cora would arrive with a breakfast tray, her quiet efficiency a constant in the whirlwind of Elara's disorientation. The king would visit each afternoon. His arrivals were never announced, yet Elara found herself anticipating them, her body attuned to the subtle shift in the atmosphere that preceded him. Their conversations were a careful, tentative dance. He spoke of his kingdom, not with boastful pride, but with the weary weight of a man who carried its every concern upon his shoulders. He told her of the stubborn northern lords, the trade disputes with the coastal clans, the endless, intricate game of politics that was played in his council chambers. He did not speak down to her. He spoke as if to an equal, as if her opinion, silent though it was, held value. In turn, he began to gently unravel the tightly wound threads of her past. He never demanded. He offered a piece of his own history, of vulnerability, and then waited. He spoke of his own loneliness, the isolating nature of the crown, the certainty that few ever saw the man beneath the title. They see a king, he said one afternoon, his gaze fixed on the fire. They see power to be leveraged or a threat to be neutralized. They rarely see a person. It was this admission, this glimpse of his own solitude, that finally loosened the knot in Elara's throat. The words came slowly at first, rusted from disuse. She told him of her home, a small pack nestled in a valley of pine trees. She spoke of her father's laugh, of her mother's skill with herbs, of simple joys that now felt like scenes from a story about another girl's life. She did not speak of the ending, not yet, and all the while, a silent biological revolution was taking place. The constant, calm presence of a compatible alpha, one who offered safety instead of threat, began to work a profound change within her. The deep freeze of her trauma began to thaw. Her omega nature, shackled and suppressed for so long, began to stir. Her scent, once a faint ghost of rain on dry earth, began to strengthen. It bloomed in the space between them, a quiet perfume of petrichor and wild iris, of life returning to barren ground. It was no longer the scent of fear. It was the scent of her essence, raw and true. Kaelen noticed. She saw the subtle change in him when he entered her rooms. He would pause just inside the door, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second as he drew in a breath. His own scent, that compelling mix of whiskey and cedar, would deepen in response, becoming richer, more textured. It was not an aggressive dominance. It was an answer, a recognition. One afternoon, he was quieter than usual. The weight of the crown seemed heavier on him. He sat in the chair opposite her, his brow furrowed. "The council argues for a marriage alliance with a southern pack," he said, the words laced with a dull frustration. "They present it as the most logical course. They do not understand that logic is a cold bedfellow." Elara's heart clenched, though she hid it. Of course, this was the reality. He was a king. He would need a queen, a proper omega from a powerful bloodline, not a scarred relic bought at auction. He looked up at her then, his winter sky eyes seeing right through her. "They believe I should want a polished jewel for a mate," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But jewels are cold. They reflect light, but they generate none of their own." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. The space between them crackled with a new, potent energy. "What called to me in that auction hall, Elara, was not what I saw. It was what I sensed. It was this." He gestured vaguely in the air between them, indicating the now rich tapestry of their mingled scents. It was a spirit of incredible strength, buried deep but still burning. It was a truth that resonated with my own. He held her gaze, and the world narrowed to this moment, to this man who saw her when everyone else had looked away. "The one who did this to you," he said, his voice so soft it was almost a caress. "Tell me." And she did. The dam broke. The words tumbled out in a torrent, raw and broken. She spoke of the betrayal of the alpha from a neighboring pack who had promised her the world, and then, on the very eve of their bonding ceremony, had revealed his true purpose. She spoke of the ambush, the screams, the smell of blood and fire. She spoke of his face twisted in cruelty, as he held her down and carved his rejection into her flesh, telling her she was a fool, that her pack was an obstacle to be removed, that she was nothing. She was shaking violently by the end, tears she did not feel coming streaming down her face, tracing the path of the scar he had given her. Kaelen did not move to comfort her. He did not try to stop the pain. He simply listened, his expression a mask of such ferocious, focused intensity that it should have been frightening. But it was not. His silence was a vessel, strong enough to hold her agony. When her voice finally failed, when the last sob had been wrenched from her, he slowly rose from his chair. He crossed the space between them and knelt before her. He was so large, so powerful, yet in that moment, he made himself her equal, her protector. He did not wipe her tears away. He reached out, his hand moving with an infinite slowness to give her every opportunity to pull away. She did not. His thumb, calloused and warm, gently brushed over the raised, ruined skin of her scar. It was not a touch of pity. It was a touch of reverence. It was a vow. "The world rejected you," he murmured, his voice a low thrum that vibrated through her very bones. "It tried to break you. It failed. This mark is not a brand of shame. It is a badge of honor. It is proof that you survived what was meant to destroy you." He rose then, leaving her with the ghost of his touch on her skin and the solid weight of his words in her soul. The fragile, terrified thing she had been was gone. In its place was something new, something raw and tender, but alive, truly alive. For the first time since the fire had consumed her old life, she felt not like a victim, but like a survivor. And she was not alone. The world beyond her chambers was a rumor, a distant murmur of life that existed in parallel to her own. King Kaelen, in his careful way, had begun to expand the borders of her sanctuary. He escorted her to the palace library, a cavernous temple of knowledge where the scent of old paper and leather mingled with the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light. He walked with her in the private royal gardens, where the air was sweet with the perfume of night-blooming jasmine and the only sounds were the crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant splash of a fountain. It was in these moments that Elara felt a semblance of peace, a fragile connection to the man who was, with a patience that felt endless, dismantling the fortress around her heart. He was her sole point of reference in this new world, her protector, her confessor. She had begun to believe, in her most secret thoughts, that perhaps this could be enough. He disabused her of that notion one evening as they stood on a balcony overlooking the main courtyard. The sun was setting, casting long shadows from the arriving carriages. "The court gathers for the autumn revel tonight," he said, his voice neutral. "You will attend with me." It was not a request. It was a statement, yet it lacked any tone of command. It was simply the inevitable next step, and he had run out of ways to shield her from it. A cold dread, colder than any she had felt in the auction hall, seeped into her bones. "I cannot," she whispered, the words barely audible. "You can," he replied, his gaze still on the courtyard below. "You are not who you were. You are under my protection." It is time they saw that. The preparation was a special kind of torture. Cora helped her into a gown of deep emerald silk, its fabric whispering of wealth she had never known. It was modestly cut, yet it clung to the curves she had begun to regain, making her feel exposed. Cora attempted to style her hair, to arrange it artfully over the ruined side of her face. "No," Elara said, the word firmer than she intended. She met her own gaze in the mirror. The scar was a part of her. It was her history. Hiding it felt like a betrayal of the survival Kaelen had praised. She shook her head, letting her hair fall as it always did. Cora nodded, a flicker of respect in her eyes. When Kaelen came to her door, he was a vision of regal power dressed in black and silver, a circlet of polished obsidian resting on his brow. His eyes swept over her, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she saw disappointment. Then he offered his arm. "You look," he said quietly, "like a queen of the ancient world, fierce and untamed." His words were a shield. She held onto them as they descended the grand staircase. The great hall was a riot of light and sound. 1,000 candles blazed, their light reflected in the jewels adorning the nobility. The air was thick with the cloying mix of perfumes and the buzz of conversation. As the king entered with her on his arm, the buzz did not quiet. It died. It was cut off as if by a blade. Hundreds of eyes turned upon them. The silence was profound, and within it, Elara heard a symphony of judgment. She felt their gazes like physical blows, raking over her, lingering on the green silk, then flying to the scar, their owner's mouths tightening with distaste. The whispers began a moment later, a hissing undercurrent beneath the suddenly resumed music. Kaelen's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, a solid, warm weight. He led her through the crowd, a sea of beautiful, hostile faces that parted before him yet closed in behind her. He introduced her to a dizzying array of lords and ladies. Their bows and curtsies were perfectly executed, their smiles meticulously crafted, but their eyes were cold and assessing. A woman glided forward, a vision in rose-gold silk. "Lady Valeria," Kaelen murmured in introduction. Her scent was overpoweringly sweet, like rotting roses. Her smile was a razor blade. "My dear," she said, her voice a melodic poison. "What a unique presentation. We were all so curious about the king's new companion. Tell me, from which obscure corner of the kingdom do you hail? I simply cannot place the style of your markings." The insult was veiled in false courtesy. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She felt the eyes of the entire court upon her, waiting for her to stumble, to prove herself the uncouth savage they believed her to be. Kaelen's body tensed beside her, a predator coiling to strike. But before he could speak, a strange calm settled over Elara. She heard his voice in her memory. "They see a broken thing. I see a survivor." She lifted her chin, meeting Lady Valeria's malicious gaze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "The North remembers its own, my lady," she said, the words cool and measured. "As I am certain it remembers yours." It was a non-answer, a deflection that held a subtle warning. It was a move in a game she had not known she knew how to play. Lady Valeria's smile tightened. A faint flush crept up her neck. She had expected a stammering girl. She had not expected this quiet composure. Kaelen's tension eased into something else. Something like pride. He did not intervene again that night. He stood by her side, a silent sentinel, as she faced down a gauntlet of veiled barbs and condescending inquiries. She did not triumph. She endured. She parried. She held her ground. She saw the politics of it then, the intricate web of alliances and enmities that Kaelen navigated every day. Lord Theron, a wolfish alpha with cold eyes, watched her with a calculating interest that felt more dangerous than Lady Valeria's petty cruelty. His gaze was not on her scar, but on the way the king stood at her shoulder. He saw her not as a person, but as a lever, a point of vulnerability in the king's armor. By the end of the evening, Elara was exhausted, her nerves frayed to their very ends. But as they left the hall, the weight of the court's disdain pressing on her from all sides, she understood. This was her battlefield now. It was not a field of blood and fire, but of silk and smiles and poisoned words. And Kaelen had not brought her here to hide behind him. He had brought her here to stand beside him. The realization was terrifying, and for the first time that night, it was also undeniably a source of strength. The fragile peace they had cultivated within the walls of the West Wing could not hold against the pressures of the world outside. The court's disdain was a constant, low hum, a persistent frost that no amount of the king's favor could entirely melt. Elara learned to navigate it, her quiet resilience becoming a form of armor. She found a strange sort of power in her own indifference, in refusing to flinch at the whispered insults she was never meant to hear. It was on a rain-swept afternoon, as she sat reading in the library, that the first thread of the past unraveled. Kaelen had been absent for 2 days, called away to settle a dispute on the eastern border. In his absence, the palace felt larger, colder, the shadows stretching just a little longer. Lord Theron found her there. He moved with a silent, predatory grace that set her teeth on edge. He did not bother with the false pleasantries of the courtiers. His smile was a thin, cold line. "Enjoying the king's literature, my lady?" he asked, his voice smooth as oiled silk. "It is a fine collection, though I imagine it pales in comparison to the archives of your own homeland." The Silvermane pack was renowned for its historical records, was it not? A great tragedy, its loss. The name of her pack, spoken aloud in this place, was a physical blow. Elara's book slipped from her numb fingers, thudding softly on the rug. No one had spoken that name since the auction. To the world, they were simply a fallen pack, a statistic. Theron's cold eyes watched her reaction, missing nothing. "The king is a busy man," he continued, circling her like a shark. "He sees a wounded bird and his protective instincts are stirred, a noble quality. But he does not always look beyond the immediate tragedy. He does not ask the most important question." He paused, letting the silence thicken. Why? Why would a minor, peaceful pack on the edge of the territory be targeted with such thoroughness? It seems an excessive amount of violence for simple banditry, does it not? He did not wait for an answer. He gave her another thin smile and melted back into the shadows of the bookshelves, leaving her alone with a heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. Why? The question echoed in her mind, relentless and terrifying. She had been so consumed by the horror of the event, by the personal betrayal and the searing pain of the blade, that she had never stopped to ask why. She had accepted it as a random act of monstrous cruelty. Now, with Theron's poison dripping in her ear, the memories began to shift, to rearrange themselves into a new and sinister pattern. She remembered the night before the attack. Her father, usually so calm, had been agitated. He had spoken with her mother in hushed, urgent tones. She had caught fragments. The treaty, too dangerous, must be moved. A treaty, not a weapon, not a treasure, a piece of parchment. Later that night, Kaelen returned. He came to her rooms, his shoulders squared with the weight of his journey, but his expression softened when he saw her. The moment his eyes met hers, he knew something was wrong. He could always see her. She did not mention Theron. Instead, she asked the question, "Why did they attack us?" Kaelen stilled. The warmth bled from his face, replaced by the grim focus of a ruler. "What do you remember, Elara?" The fragments came tumbling out. Her father's anxiety, the whispered argument, the mention of a treaty, a thing too dangerous to keep. Kaelen listened, his winter sky eyes turning to ice. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. "There was an old accord," he said finally, his voice low and hard, "forged generations ago between your pack and the crown. It ceded a tract of your northern land, a place considered barren, to the royal domain. In exchange, your pack was granted permanent tax exemption and a seat on the royal council." He began to pace, the energy rolling off him now a controlled storm. "The land was thought to be worthless. Until recently, my surveyors discovered it sits atop the largest vein of sunstone ever found, sunstone, the rare mineral that powered the kingdom's most advanced machinery and weaponry. The source of its wealth and military might. The treaty was a formality, Kaelen said, his jaw tight. A historical curiosity. I had intended to renegotiate it, to ensure your pack was properly compensated. But if someone else knew of the discovery before it was made public. He stopped pacing and looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the same horrifying realization dawning. They would not just want the land. They would need the original treaty destroyed, to erase any prior claim your people had, to make the theft clean. The attack was not random. It was not a simple act of betrayal by a rogue alpha. It was a calculated, political assassination. Her pack was not an obstacle to be removed. It was a loose end to be tied up. Her scar was not just a mark of rejection. It was a witness mark. The assassin had believed he was silencing the last living soul who could connect the massacre to the stolen treaty. The room seemed to tilt. Elara gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. The personal tragedy she had carried for so long was suddenly devastatingly political. Her family had not died because of a spurned alpha's rage. They had died for a rock, for power, for greed. Kaelen was before her in an instant, his hands on her arms, his gaze burning with a new terrifying intensity. This changes everything, he said, his voice a low, furious vow. This was not an attack on a pack. It was an attack on the crown, on me, on the very law of this land. His protectiveness shifted, transforming from the care of a man for a woman into the absolute focus of a king for his subject, for his queen. I will tear this kingdom apart to find who did this, he promised, the words leaving no room for doubt. I will unearth every conspirator, every traitor who had a hand in this. I will have justice for you, for your family. He pulled her into his arms, not in passion, but in solidarity, in a pact. His heart beat a steady, furious rhythm against her cheek. The warmth of him, the scent of cedar and whiskey, now smelled of vengeance and resolve. The wounded bird was gone. In her place stood the last daughter of the Silvermane pack, the sole key to a conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of power. The king's quest for justice had become her own. Their fates, once entwined by chance and compassion, were now bound by blood and a shared, burning purpose. The game had changed entirely. The palace, once a place of whispered threats and veiled contempt, now felt like a gilded trap. Every shadow seemed to hold a new menace, every passing glance a potential threat. The knowledge that her family's murder was a calculated act of political avarice transformed Elara's grief into a cold, sharp thing. It was a blade she kept sheathed within her heart, its edge honed on the whetstone of betrayal. King Kaelen became a vortex of controlled fury. His investigations were conducted in the deepest secrecy, his most trusted agents moving like ghosts through the kingdom's underbelly. He shared his findings with her, treating her not as a fragile thing, to be protected from the truth, but as a partner in this dark endeavor. They pored over maps and council ledgers in his private study late into the night, their heads bent together, their world narrowed to the hunt. The trust between them, once a tender, budding thing, solidified into something unbreakable, a bond, tempered in the fires of shared purpose. His presence was no longer just a comfort. It was her anchor in a raging sea. Her scent of rain and wild iris deepened, becoming clearer, stronger, a signal of clarity and resolve that answered the smoky intensity of his own. The attack came on a night when the moon was shrouded by thick clouds. Elara had retired to her chambers, her mind buzzing with the day's fruitless inquiries. The sense of being watched had become a constant prickling on her skin. She was learning to trust that instinct. She heard it then, a faint scuff of a boot on stone outside her door, a presence that did not belong. It was not the familiar, comforting cadence of the royal guard. This step was too light, too deliberate. A sliver of darkness appeared beneath her door as a shadow blocked the torchlight from the corridor. Fear, cold and immediate, shot through her. But it was a different fear than the one that had once paralyzed her. This was a clean, sharp adrenaline. It was the fear of a prey animal that has learned to fight. She did not scream. She slid silently from her bed, grabbing the heavy silver hairbrush from her vanity, her only available weapon. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her heart hammering a wild drum against her ribs. The door clicked open. A figure, clad in black and masked, slipped inside. The faint light glinted on a long, wicked blade in his hand. He moved toward the bed, toward the shape of the rumpled covers. He never saw her. With a cry that was part terror and part pure fury, Elara brought the silver brush down on the back of his head with all her strength. It was not enough to fell him, but it was enough to stagger him, to make him roar in surprise and pain. He turned, his eyes blazing with murderous intent behind the mask. It was all the time she needed. She screamed then, a raw, piercing sound that shattered the palace silence. The door exploded inward. Kaelen stood there, not in his nightclothes, but fully dressed, as if he had been pacing his own rooms, sleepless with the need to protect her. He took in the scene in a single, devastating glance. The assassin, the knife, Elara standing defiant and terrified with a useless piece of silver in her hand, a sound ripped from the king's throat that was not human. It was the primal roar of an alpha whose mate was in peril. The force of his rage and his power filled the room, a physical pressure that made the very air crackle. The assassin, for all his training, faltered under the onslaught of pure, undulated dominance. It was his last mistake. Kaelen moved with a speed that blurred. There was a brutal, efficient struggle, a sickening crunch, and then silence. The assassin lay still at his feet. Kaelen crossed the room into strides. His hands came up to cradle her face, his touch shockingly gentle against the violence that still radiated from him. His eyes scanned her frantically, checking for injury. Elara, look at me. Are you hurt? She shook her head, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving her trembling. She was safe. He was here. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel the frantic beat of his heart against her own. He was shaking. The unflappable king was shaking. I thought I would be too late, he whispered into her hair, his voice ragged with a fear she had never heard in him before. The thought of losing you. It is a darkness I cannot face. He drew back, his hands sliding down to her shoulders, his gaze intense, burning with a fire that was both fury and something else, something profound and terrifyingly vulnerable. I have spent my life ruling, he said, his voice low and fervent. I have made decisions of war and peace. I have built alliances and crushed enemies. But it all feels like ash compared to you. You are the only truth I have ever been certain of. He sank to one knee before her, a king brought to his knees not by an enemy, but by his own heart. He took her hands in his thumbs stroking over her knuckles. I do not offer you this because you are an Omega and I am an Alpha. I offer it because you are Elara, and I am Kaelen. You are my equal in every way that matters. You are my strength, my partner, my queen in every sense but title. He looked up at her, his winter sky eyes holding hers captive. Will you fight beside me? Will you stand with me, not just in this hunt for justice, but for every day that follows? Will you let me love you? Will you be mine? It was not a command. It was a question, a plea. The most powerful man in the kingdom was offering her his heart, his throne, his future, and asking for hers in return. Elara looked down at him, at this man who had seen her worth in a room full of people who saw none, who had fought for her, respected her, and now loved her with a ferocity that shook the world. The last of her fears melted away, not into nothingness, but into a radiant, unshakable certainty. She did not speak. Words were too small for this. Instead, she sank down to her knees before him, meeting him as his equal. She framed his face with her hands, her touch sure and steady. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of mere passion, though passion was there, a roaring river contained within the gesture. It was a seal. It was an answer. It was a vow as binding as any spoken oath. It was her surrender, not to him, but to them, to the undeniable, unbreakable truth that had been forged in fire and sealed in blood. In the silence of the room, with the shadow of death lying vanquished beside them, the rejected Omega girl and the Alpha King found their beginning. The silence that followed their kiss was louder than any proclamation. It was filled with the echo of a vow made without words, a future chosen in the ruins of the past. They rose from the floor together, their hands still clasped, their world narrowed to the truth that pulsed between them. The body of the assassin was a stark reminder of the battle still raging, but it could not touch the sanctity of the peace they had just forged. Guards arrived, their faces grim, and Kaelen issued quiet, precise orders, his voice once more that of a king, though his eyes never left Elara. The threat was removed, the scene cleared, but the message was seared into the stone walls of the palace. The war had been brought to their door, and they would answer it together. The days that followed were a whirlwind of calculated action. The attempted assassination was not hidden away but announced to the court with cold fury by the king. It was a declaration, An attack on her was an attack on the crown itself. The investigation, once a shadow game, exploded into the open. The evidence Kaelen's agents had meticulously gathered was now unleashed. Ledgers showing unexplained wealth, clandestine meetings, and the damning testimony of a Sunstone surveyor who had been bribed and later threatened, all pointed to one man, Lord Theron. He had not wielded the knife himself, but his fingerprints were on the hilt. He had orchestrated the massacre of the Silvermane pack to acquire the land and its riches, believing a minor, isolated pack would be an easy forgotten target. He had seen the king's interest in a scarred Omega not as a complication, but as an opportunity, a chance to eliminate the last witness and destabilize the throne in one move. The confrontation did not happen on a battlefield but in the throne room, under the unforgiving gaze of the entire court. Theron, cornered and arrogant, tried to wield his influence and silver tongue to twist the facts and play to the prejudices of the nobles. He sneered at Elara, attempting to reduce her to the scarred, worthless creature he believed her to be. He never got the chance to finish. Elara stepped forward. She did not shout. She did not need to. Her voice, clear and resonant, carried to every corner of the vast hall. She spoke not with the anger of a victim, but with the unwavering authority of a queen. She recounted the truth of that night, not just the personal horror, but the political calculus behind it. She laid bare his greed, his treason, his utter disregard for the laws he was sworn to uphold. She was the living evidence of his crime, and her testimony was unassailable. The court watched, utterly silenced, not by the king's power, but by hers, by the fierce, unbreakable spirit that shone from her, making the scar on her face not a mark of shame, but a badge of honor, a testament to the truth she had survived to tell. Theron's allies shrank back from him, their faces pale. His house of cards collapsed under the weight of her truth and the king's iron will. Justice, so long delayed, was finally served. Weeks later, the great hall was transformed. Where there had been cold judgment, there was now a palpable awe. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, glinting off gold and jewels, but the brightest light in the room was the woman standing beside the king. Elara wore a gown of ivory and silver, and on her brow rested a circlet of intertwined platinum and sunstone, a symbol of the past honored and a future secured. The scar was there on full display. It was a part of her history, and her history had made her their queen. The high priestess spoke the ancient words, binding their hands together with a silver cord. Kaelen looked at her, his winter sky eyes soft with a love that was both tender and fierce. He spoke his vows, not to the court, but to her alone, his voice a private promise in a public space. She answered him, her voice steady, her gaze never wavering from his. When the priestess declared them bound, a cheer erupted, not from a place of mere tradition, but from genuine hope. The rejected Omega girl, sold for a king's ransom, was now crowned queen of the realm. The music swelled. He turned to her, his hand resting on the small of her back, and they took their first steps together as rulers, as partners, as mates. They did not dance alone for long. Soon the floor was filled, but the courtiers kept a respectful distance, orbiting the bright central sun of their union. Later, on the same balcony where he had first declared his intent, they looked out over their kingdom. The stars were emerging, countless points of light in the velvet dark. His arm was around her, holding her close against the evening chill. "It is done," she said softly, the words a release of a breath she felt she had been holding for a lifetime. "No," Kaelen murmured, his lips brushing her temple. "It is just beginning." He turned her to face him, his hand gently tracing the line of her jaw, his touch a permanent promise. "The pain is past, Elara. The future is ours to write together." She leaned into his touch, into the strength and the love that had seen her when she was invisible to the world. She was no longer the girl from the auction block. She was a queen, a survivor, a woman deeply and utterly loved. The journey that had begun in rejection and despair had found its glorious, hard-won destination. In his arms, under the watchful stars, they stood, two halves of a single soul, finally and forever whole. The end.